All right, well, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Community Church. My name is Tom Pryor. I'm one of the pastors here at the church, and we are in part 2 of a message series called Feels, where we're taking a look at the emotions that Jesus experienced. We're taking some time to kind of see what he felt and what he went through. Because here's the deal, and you probably know this to be the case even without thinking about it, so this might be saying something you already are aware of, but it's different when you're told the details of a story, right? The people, the places, the when, the how, and it's very different from when you are aware of what the people that were going through all of that felt as they were going through it, right? Like when you are, let's say, pursuing a person, you want to get to know somebody, you want to form whether a platonic or romantic relationship with a person, it's one thing to be like, oh, tell me about where you grew up, your family, what you do for work. It's a whole other thing to be like, well, tell me how you feel about your work. Do you like your boss? Do you like the work that you do? What kind of impact do you think it's making? Or do you like where you grew up? Tell me what it's like to grow up in that part of the country. It says a whole lot more. The emotions a person experiences often tells you a lot more about who that person is, right? It's like going from black and white details into full-on color, vivid, bright. You start to feel like you know a person much more intimately. And this was the case for me growing up. I grew up with a grandfather who was born in 1914, and he grew up in New York. But for some reason, and I don't know why this is the case, we just discovered over time that certain things could just set him off. Like he would just go on a rant about certain things. And one of those things was the Rockefeller family. Now, I don't know what it was. I didn't grow up in 1914, though I might look like I did. But maybe he worked for them at some point and they owed him money or they took advantage of people that he loved. I don't know what it was, but my uncles knew, as we all did, that he would immediately get angry and just go off. That if my uncles, my dad's younger brothers, if they were in trouble or they did something my grandfather didn't like, all they had to do was drop it hey Dad, why don't you tell us about the Rockefellers? And all of a sudden, Grandpa just starts going, he's ticked off, he totally forgets what they did wrong, and they go scot-free because Grandpa's on his loony raving about the Rockefellers. I don't know, maybe he hated the big tree thing they put up in December. I don't know what it was exactly, but we did know, that showed us something about him. There was some core experience that he had that you did not want to bring up. To this day, I don't know exactly what it was, but the Rockefellers, don't bring them around Grandpa. So here's the thing, right? Whether it makes a person sad or happy or worried or scared, fearful, they tell you about a person. Growing up, I did not want to cry ever, in front of people. I was I'm too cool, manly, whatever for that. I don't know what has changed in me, but have you ever seen the movie Coco? That's funny. That hurts my feelings. I do feel, thank you very much. The ending of that movie, I wept like a baby. My wife held me because how dare you? The ending and I don't want to ruin it because I might choke up, but no, it all came together and it was just this beautiful display and I was just overwhelmed. I watched the show Bluey. Anybody watch the show Bluey? If you have young children, you've probably heard of Bluey. It's a family of dogs that live in Australia. It seems like animals took over the earth. Human beings are done and gone. And these two parents are probably the greatest parents on the planet. And the way they love their kids it just gets to me. And I can be watching and they'll go camping and I'm just and the kids are oh, it's so funny. I'm yeah, it's real funny. Because it says something about my values have changed. I am a parent, so now I see the world differently. My emotions, or if you can be aware of my emotions, it tells you a little bit about who I am. And that's the case for Jesus. He was a teacher. He was a rabbi in the eyes of a lot of people. But unfortunately, a lot of depictions of Jesus are of one who's a stoic, or he didn't even, not even that he had to have emotions, because nothing ever affected him. People have this idea of Jesus being this guy who's just he just floated above all of the cares and concerns of the world. It's just follow me and set your eyes on the things of heaven and things will be awesome. And it's that's just not an accurate picture of who he was. He was a human being. He was born in a manger. We just celebrated this like a few weeks ago, right? He was born in like a feeding trough and experienced like life on earth, but he was fully human. He had emotion. He wasn't a stoic. It was just like, oh, all you need to do is suppress your emotions and life will be fine. That's just not the case. That's just not what we see with Jesus. Instead, what we see is a guy who is deeply moved, that things affected him, that he went through life and life wasn't always good to him or the people he cared about. And so he had emotions that reflected that reality. And here's why that's so important. It's because I think a lot of us, like if you've heard about Jesus or he's like some philosopher that's like whatever, you're like, that's not real. Like I go through stuff every day. Am I gonna like submit and follow a teacher who has no experience with the real world? And if you've rejected that version of Jesus, that makes sense, because that's not what we see in the New Testament. So what we want to do with this series is kind of be like, here's the more accurate picture of who Jesus was. Here's how he responded, not just with his actions, but emotionally to what was going on in his life. And you'll be like, wow, this guy is relatable. But also, the Apostle Paul tells us in his letter to the church in Colossae, like 2,000 years ago, he's like, Jesus, if you believe in him as the Son of God, he is the image, the representation of God the Father, of the invisible God. So when you pray and you think about who God is and what he's like, and you're worried like, does God even care? Does God feel at all? Does he have any kind of inclination towards mankind? Does his heart beat towards me as an individual? Does he see my plight? Does he see my experiences? Does he laugh when I laugh? Does he cry when I cry? Is he heartbroken when I'm heartbroken? Well, if Jesus is any indication, Paul would say, yeah, he's the image of the invisible God. So that's why we're doing this series. We want to paint an accurate picture so that you might choose to either follow and submit to and give your life and your all to this rabbi, teacher, Lord, Savior, and King, or you can actually push away from the real deal instead of some cheap imitation that doesn't exist. So last week, Lou spent some time talking about Jesus' response to the people of Israel 2,000 years ago. In that first century, they weren't doing so great. They were under the rule of Rome, and Jesus looks at them and he starts to feel something for them. And it says that Jesus looks at them not with like an attitude like, these religious people, why can't they just get it right? Like, just pray the right way or behave the right way or just do what I said. Do what all the people said before me. Like, just do that. It's like, no, Jesus looks at them like they're sheep without a shepherd. He looks at them as if they are a people without a guide, without a leader. And he looks at them, and the word and the emotion for last week was compassion. That he saw them, and he wanted more for them. He wanted better for them. He saw the spiritual hunger, like the hope that they wanted desperately, like the idea that there's more out there in this life. And he's like, I want them to have it too. The good news is like, I'm that guy. I'm the good shepherd to them. If they would just embrace me and choose to follow me, they could have what they're looking for. So the word last week was compassion. Now, this week is not as kind as compassion. It's not as fun. But I do think that the thing we're going to look at this week, I think if you're a person who's ever wondered, like, does God even care at all? Does he even, like, when he comes and looks in my life, does he always like, no, I see that person and I worry about them? Or is he just like, more generally concerned about the 8 billion people on the planet? Where does God sit in all this? Can he be bothered to be bothered? Right? Does he ever turn his attention toward my circumstance? Does he ever feel anything for me? If you've ever wondered that, or if you wonder if like he's even there at all, this is a good message for you. I think this might be the most compelling reason to even give Jesus your time and your attention and investigate, if not follow him altogether. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to spend some time looking at a story where Jesus is deeply affected. He's very much moved. And I think you'd be surprised by how he handles all of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the 26th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. That's the recording of his life, his ministry, his death and resurrection, put together by a guy named Matthew. And we're like right at the tail end of this book. All right, we're jumping into chapter 26. The book only goes to chapter 28. So we're near the end, right? So a lot has transpired, a ton. He spent, 30 years or so in total obscurity. Like no one knew who Jesus was. He literally came from a town that like no one cared about. I once owned a home in Middle Island. And when I would try to tell people where Middle Island was, I would tell them, it's in the middle of the island. That's how important Middle Island was. That's what it's got going for it. It's just there. That's where Jesus grew up. He grew up in Nazareth. People are like, can anything important, anything good come from Nazareth? Like, that's who he was. He was nobody. And then he shows up on the scene. And then he starts teaching people when he was about 30 years old. And starts telling them, hey, God has not forgotten you. Like, let me show you a better way. Yeah, I'm sure you want, the government to go away and to stop harassing you and all that stuff, but there's a way to live that gets you through all of that to the other side. Come follow me. And he would talk about God, and he'd talk about life, and he'd talk about their place in the world. And people were like, this is really amazing stuff. We've never heard things like this. And he drew a crowd. But the problem when you draw a crowd, when you gain some notoriety or attention, or you say things that seem really good to people, is that there's going to be critics. And there were critics, and most of the critics were the religious leaders of the day. And they looked at Jesus like, okay, this guy's messing things up. Not just for us professionally, like they're taking our jobs. Like Jesus is getting in the way of that. But like he's saying some pretty dangerous things. Saying like he's more important than like our heroes of the faith, like Moses and Abraham. He's saying he's one with God. That's blasphemy. How could this guy ever say that? And people are following him. They're going to go down a dangerous road. We better take him out. We better kill him. And Jesus is very aware at this point of what's coming down the line for him. He knows there's going to be a grotesque, brutal ending for him. And he has this moment where he's sitting with his disciples and they're celebrating the last, what we call the Last Supper. It was during the time of Passover for the Jewish people. And he's sitting with them and he tells them like, my body's going to break for you. And I break this bread, like, don't forget this. My blood's going to be poured out for you. Pay attention to this. And then Judas leaves, one of his disciples, to go betray him. And Jesus is aware of all of the goings on right now. And then they leave that place, that dinner, for Jesus to go and pray. And this is what it says. We're going to pick this up in Matthew 26. It says, then Jesus went with his disciples, that's his students, to a place called Gethsemane. That was at the base of the Mountain of Olives, where Gethsemane, they would press the olives to make olive oil. And he said to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. Like, I'm in such a bad shape. He's talking to his 12 followers, or 11 at this point. Judas is gone. He's like, I need to pray. Which when I read that, I'm like, wait a second. Out of all the people on the planet that ever needed to pray, Jesus needed to pray? Like, he was one with, the same as, connected to. Couldn't he just be like, dear me, can I make it better for you, me, us together? Like, but he was in such a bad way that he absolutely needed God on his side. Like, he was like, fellas, just hang around. I'm looking down the timeline of my life, and I see those days coming, and it's going to be really, really bad. I need to seek God. So it says he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, two other disciples, so the three of them, with Jesus, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he says to them the following, my soul, next slide, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. I'm not doing so good. I'm so overwhelmed. I'm so crushed by the circumstances in my life. I'm so squeezed by all of these pressures that are coming together on top of me that I feel like I'm going to die. So please, when he says keep watching, it just means please stay awake with me. Just hang out with me. That's all I need. Have you ever been in a situation where it's like you just want people around because you feel like so scared, so helpless and hopeless? You're just like, I don't need words of advice. I'm aware of my situation. I don't need platitudes like, oh, don't worry, everything happens for a reason, which I know is very well-meaning, but like, That's not helping me right now. I just need my closest people, my friends. I just need people to just sit with me. Don't say anything. I just need your presence. That's how rough it's going for Jesus. He's like, just keep watch, stay awake, hang out, sit with me. And the story continues saying, going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Like, God, please, I am begging you. I am pleading with you. Is there any way this can end differently? Is there anything we can do? If you are a good God, if you are a loving and present and ever active Heavenly Father, there's something I'm sure you could do. Could you please step into my story and change the ending? And then he prays this incredible prayer where he says, that's what I want, but it's not my world. It's yours. So your will be done. And then Luke adds, and being in anguish. You can see all this like emotional language being used. In anguish, right? That's like internal, just complete agony and torment. He prayed more earnestly, even more sincerely, and his sweat began to drop like drops of blood falling to the ground. Like he's so overcome. He's probably on the verge of like throwing up from the anxiety and the worry that he's feeling. And then you'll see a pattern here. And then he returned to his disciples, his students, and found them sleeping. Guys, couldn't you men keep watch, stay awake with me for 1 hour, he asked Peter. He asked them again, please, watch and pray. Next slide. So that you will not fall into temptation. Like, I told you, like, I'm worried that some of you, you're going to give up. You're going to give up on me. You're going to give up on God. You're going to try to save your own skin because everything's going to go haywire. Like, pray that you don't fall into temptation. Your spirit is willing, right? Like, you want this. We want this. But the truth is, our flesh, is weak. We give in. We don't stay. We don't stay awake. We don't do the things we want to do when we're pressed. And it says, he went away. Jesus went away a second time and prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, if this is the only way through, either way, your will be done. And it continues and says, when he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. See, here it's like, I guess Jesus never took a long road trip with his disciples. Like, they were in the car, and Jesus was driving, and one of them was in the co-pilot seat, and they're going like 6-7 hours, and he's watching these guys like try to stay awake, and they're like, and then he turns to them and is like, hey, what's the deal? He's like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm trying to stay awake. I'm trying to stay awake for you. Have you ever been one of those drivers and you're like, why don't you just do us all a favor and just like recline the seat a little bit, take a little nap, and then when the time comes, we'll switch places and you can drive because you'll be refreshed. Have you guys ever been that before? Yeah, me too. My wife likes to say, I'll stay awake for you. And I'm like, no, you're terrible at it, and it's not working, and when I'm gonna need you, you're gonna be tired. So how about you just sleep? See, Jesus never had that experience. These guys can barely keep their eyes open. Luke adds, I'm being silly, but Luke adds like they are exhausted from grief. They themselves are done. But Jesus is like, please, I know what I'm about to go through. Can you stay awake with me? And it continues and it says, so he left them and went away once more and prayed the third time, the same thing, like, God, take this cup, take this lot in life. I have a terrible hand that I'm supposed to play cards with. Can I get a new hand? Can this circumstance change? If you're there, if you care, if you're listening, please let this outcome be different. And then it says he returns to his disciples who are still sleeping, and he says to them, are you still sleeping and resting? And then he turns to them and he's like, look, there's Judas. The hour has come. It's time. I'm going to be handed off and arrested. And the story goes that Jesus is then taken. He's beaten. He is mocked. He is spit upon. He is whipped. He is hurt. He is put a crown of thorns has been put on his head. Eventually, he's led through the streets, and people like are taking it in almost as a form of entertainment, because Rome knew how to humiliate and punish and have someone suffer. He has to actually carry the crossbar for the crucifix that he's about to be nailed to through the streets, and then eventually he's killed. And a lot of times when we talk about what Jesus did for people, we spend a lot of time thinking about the physical torture that he endured. And that's very true and something worth considering, right? If you've ever heard of the movie or the phrase, the Passion of the Christ, the word passion means suffering. So that whole idea is the suffering of the Christ, which actually the word compassion means to suffer with somebody. So when you have compassion towards a person, it's like you suffer with them, even if you're not going through the same thing. But Jesus suffered physically all of that torture, but he also suffered emotionally, mentally, to the point where it was going to break him. And here's why this is so important, is that you and I cannot relate to Jesus, I don't think, when it comes to the physical suffering and a crucifixion. I don't know if anybody has that in their next week, in their calendar. But I am certain that every single one of us has experienced distress. Intense, deep, extreme emotional suffering, agony, and anguish. Now, we use this term a lot to talk about like a damsel in distress, right? A woman who's helpless and needs rescuing from a hero. Or you may have heard like the word distress when a boat might be lost at sea and they send out a distress call like, hey, we don't know where we're going, there's big waves, there's lots of wind. But really, this is about the internal restlessness and living hell of a person's soul. When you are in total distress, it is so crushing that it becomes a physical thing, where you sweat like drops of blood, where you feel nauseated, like you just are so sick because you're looking down the timeline of your life and you know something's coming. Whether it's something because of a decision you made, or somebody else's decision, or somebody else's action, or it's just life, and you are in agony about this thing. Have you ever been so bent out of shape about where your life or somebody else's life is going that you get on your knees, literally, and you just beg God for it to be different? That there must be a way out of this circumstance. That you pray and you're like, God, if you are there, you may not even be a believing person, a person with any faith, or you might be a straight up atheist, but you're so racked with internal pain. You're like, please, if there is a God, I would do whatever it takes to change my circumstances. If you've been there, you felt distress. Maybe you've been in a place like that and you're just looking around and be like, please, listen, I just need my friends near me. Can I just lean on you? You don't have to tell me why I'm going through this or how to make it better. I don't need words. I just need your time and your presence and your affection for a little bit. And it feels like you're alone and nobody's actually there. If you've ever felt any of those things, you felt what Jesus has felt. And this is profound. What it really means is that he has been there. He's walked that road. Yeah, the circumstances might be wildly different, right? This is 2,000 years ago. No one should be getting tortured or punished or crucified this week. But the emotions that Jesus felt in the garden are the same kind of emotions that you and I can feel when things go totally in the wrong direction. There are other times in the Gospels before this scene where the Gospel writers tell us that Jesus wept, that he would cry when he would look at the people and see the state of the people of Israel and see how destitute and brokenhearted and longing for help. Sometimes he would weep. Sometimes he would think about his friend Lazarus, who was dead, and it would make him cry. He was not unmoved by his circumstances. He wasn't a stoic philosopher who just said, oh, what you need to do is just shut down your emotions and pretend everything's fine. That is not who Jesus was. And that matters a great deal. The author of Hebrews says this: for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses. Now, there's some language in here that needs to be explained. So the high priest terminology comes from the ancient Jewish way of worship. There was a temple, there was a building, very ornate building, And there were priests who were allowed to participate in the life of the building and do the things they were supposed to do as being a part of the Jewish people. They were priests. But there was one priest selected, like the best of the best, selected to be the high priest. And this guy would go into a room that only he could go in, where they believed the literal presence of God existed on planet Earth. And he would go in like once a year to deal with God on the behalf of the whole nation of Israel. Now, whether you believe that or not, that's for another time. But this, what the author of Hebrews is saying is like, that whole idea, Jesus is that for all of us, for all the world. Like, he goes on behalf to God and says, hey, can you help them out? Can you look in their direction? Can you pay attention to what's going on in their lives? And the best part is, it's not because Jesus was so good and so perfect and never skinned his knee and never suffered and never made a mistake and never did anything wrong, but instead, he is able to empathize with our weaknesses because he's been there. And then it says, but we have one, rather, not like one who can't empathize, but one who has been tempted or tested in every way, just as we are. This Jewish rabbi, teacher, leader, then later Savior and King, he wasn't floating above the world's problems. He stepped into the world's problems. When you read the gospel stories, Jesus often, when people would like walk away from a mess, particularly with like the religious leaders of the days, they'd be like, can't touch that, I am not going near any of that. Jesus would walk towards it and step into that person's story. And now he's in a story where he can't find a way out himself. And he's being tested and tempted just as you and I are. And the writer of Hebrews says, yet he did not sin. He didn't give up. He didn't walk away. He didn't throw it all out when it didn't go the way he wanted. And what that shows us is that not only has Jesus been there, where he's walked, where we have walked, maybe not the circumstances, but the emotions, is that he gets us. He understands. He empathizes. He knows what it's like to be on your knees crying for help. And I have to say something about this real quick. You may have heard of this like movement or thing called He Gets Us. There's been like Instagram ads. There was a Super Bowl commercial where it was like, Jesus understands what you're going through. He was an outsider. He was an immigrant. He was hated for being different, all these different things. And some people have poked fun at that, but the point is like, he's not unfamiliar with being human. There's media and there's art and there's stories telling like about Jesus that are just an inaccurate picture. He was very much moved and affected by and had emotions about life and the circumstances he found himself in. And why is this important? Because it is such good news. Because of this, because he has been there, because he gets us, this is what it means. And this is how the author of Hebrews concludes all of this. He says this, because we have a Jesus, a high priest who understands, who can empathize, who sees your pain and understands what it's like to be in pain, let us then approach God's throne of grace. That is, let us go to God, the one who says he's in our corner, with what? Awe, gratitude, reverence, like, ooh. Maybe it's trepidation or worry or fear that he's not going to care. How do we go, like, God, do you see me? I know there's like 8 billion of us here on the planet. Do you even care? Do you care that I'm worried about my finances? Do you care that I'm looking at what's coming down the line? God, I don't know what I'm supposed to do for work. I feel very alone. I don't have the person in my life that I want to spend the rest of my life with. Do you even care? When you see me, do you just see another person with a million problems and then you just want to turn a blind eye? What do you even see? Like, how do you look at me, God? Should I be in awe, in reverence? How do I come before you? With all the right words? Do I have to wear the right clothes buttoned up, brushing my teeth and smelling fine before I can talk to you? Do I have to pray a certain way? How do I do it? And the author of Hebrews says, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, boldness, without hesitation, without reservation, with all of the wrong words, with all the swear words you want, you can go to God and be real and raw and begging and pleading and wanting things to be different. You can accuse him of being absent. Not because we're perfect and we've got it made, but because we have one who has gone before us who was perfect. And we can go to the throne of grace with confidence because Jesus goes on our behalf. And he has been there, and he gets us. And what do we get in exchange? A way out? Not necessarily. Jesus didn't get the way out he wanted, but instead, we may receive grace. We may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. That is, grace is, right, the belief that God is in our corner, and mercy, that God, his heart also breaks for us. He doesn't want us to suffer. And he looks at us like, I wish it were different too. What can I give to you to help you get through to the other side? What that means is this. When we are in the thick of it, we can approach God confidently because he's been there and Jesus understands us. And here's the thing. I don't want to bring up something that might be very real and personal in your life right now, but it'd be like if you're going through a really messy, painful, ugly, like divorce. Maybe you know somebody that's going through something like that. When you want help, when you want words of comfort or encouragement or advice, do you go to the person, let's just imagine, do you go to the person who has never been in a significant relationship? No, that person has no idea what you're going through. Where now there's family stuff and there's kids and housing and the future and finance and all this legal stuff that has to be sorted out. Do you go to the person that's never been even close, remotely close to that? No. Or do you go to the person who's got the perfect relationship where like the two people in that relationship, they just serve one another so well. They put the cap back on the toothpaste and they squeeze it from the bottom like a real human who cares. And they change the laundry before it sits too long and starts to stink without being asked. And then they take it from the dryer and they fold it and put it away. Unbelievable. Like, is that who you go to in the thick of that divorce? Or do you go to the person who's been through a messy one? Who's been through all of the anger and the guilt and the shame and the pain and the suffering and the begging God that it would end differently, but somehow has made it through to the other side. And maybe it's not all perfect and dandy now, but who do you talk to? You talk to the person who can empathize, somebody who's been down that road. And that is what the author of Hebrews is saying. We can go to God, not because God doesn't care, but because Jesus, the image of the invisible God, literally went through things. Not the same circumstances, but the emotions were the same. We are human beings. We feel, we suffer all the same. We bleed the same. But that is the rabbi, the leader, the teacher, the Savior and King we get to follow and trust. So the encouragement for you and me, is that we would follow this Jesus and give it a chance. So when you're tempted, be like, how can I ever bring this to God? I haven't talked to him once in my life, and now I'm finally wanting help. He's going to look at me and be like, who the heck are you? No. When you're tempted to feel like, oh, I got to get everything right and in order before I talk to him, I got to make sure I go to church and give money and say and be nice to strangers. Like, sure, those are great things, but you don't have to do any of those things before you go to the throne of grace. You can go confidently because Jesus has been down that road. He has been on his knees begging and pleading and sweating it out before God. And you can too. So I don't know what it is for you. Maybe it's a marriage thing. Maybe it's a relationship thing. Maybe you're looking at your finances like, I don't know how 2025 is going to make any sense. Maybe you're a parent and you're thinking about your kids, or you're a grandparent and you're thinking about your kids and your grandkids, and you're like, this world is insane. I don't know how they're going to make any sense of it. And it breaks your heart. And you're like, Jesus has so many more things to worry about. God has so many more things on his plate. How could he ever care about how I feel? The answer is he does, because he's been there and he understands you. So my encouragement would be to go boldly, without hesitation, and give him a chance to show you grace and mercy.